In the year 1066, England was invaded twice, and the victor of this conflict forever changed the history of Europe and the world.
"1066, the Battle of Hastings, is the most important date in English history, I think without exception.
I'm Royce Gibson, and I'll be guiding you through the Battle of Hastings.
In 1066, England was inhabited by the Anglo-Saxons, a Germanic people who had conquered it during the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They had lived under a single king since the 9th century, and politically were more connected with Scandinavia than with France. They fought in the traditional shield wall formation, interlocking their round shields to provide a front line of defense. Armies would then march their shield walls against each other and meet in a great shoving, stabbing match. Our story begins as any good story would, in London, where the king, Edward the Confessor, is on his deathbed. The king has no heir, which is a problem. Although the Anglo-Saxon king was technically chosen by the election of his nobles and not by inheritance, royal blood was considered an important factor in choice of king. By this point in Edward's reign, the kingdom was being run in large part by Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, who was also the king's brother-in-law.
Harold is the most powerful man in England, arguably more so than Edward the Confessor himself, who's been reduced to a puppet by the end of his reign.
When King Edward died on January 5th, 1066, Harold was named king and crowned the next day. It was very unusual to hold a coronation so soon after the previous king's death, possibly suggesting that Harold anticipated resistance to his succession. Whatever the case, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that he had been promised the throne by Edward before he died. William sent a strongly worded message to King Harold, asking him to uphold the oaths that he had apparently made to William while in Normandy a year or two before. Normandy was a relatively small but powerful kingdom carved out of France by Viking invaders in the 9th century. The Knights of Normandy were experienced soldiers and adherents of chivalry, a code that had not yet caught on in England. William's stake in English politics was based mostly on his relation to Edward, who was half Norman and raised in Normandy. Harold refused to abdicate on his behalf, and so William called together his allies and vassals and began building a fleet to take him to England. Hearing that William was busy preparing to invade and uphold his claim, Harold had his own huge fleet built and the populace levied to defend England's southern coast. In the 11th century, fleets were not intended to face other fleets in naval battle so much as to provide a way to move an army quickly to counter an invasion landing. The Anglo-Saxon levy, called the fyrd, was composed of freemen who owed military service to the king as part of their taxes. The army waited on the shore several months for the invasion, but William didn't arrive. On September 8th, the men were given permission to return home, and the king himself returned to London. But not long after this, word arrived that England had been invaded. It wasn't William and his knights who landed, but Harald Hardrada, the infamous king of Norway who was essentially a Viking superstar. He landed in the north of England with Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, and defeated the young earls of Northumbria and Mercia at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. Harold sprang into action, rushing north and covering over 200 miles in 5 days. When he and his army came upon the Norwegians, they were sprawled across the countryside, waiting to exchange hostages with the defeated English. Most of the soldiers weren't even wearing their chainmail, and the ensuing battle was a massacre. King Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson were killed, and the foreign threat was neutralized. Just as the English were celebrating this victory, news came from the south. William had landed and sacked several villages on the coast. Harold rushed south again, meeting William on the 14th of October near Hastings in Sussex, where only a fraction of his full force had arrived. Determined to stop William from breaking away towards London, Harold assembled his army on a hill blocking William's way to the road. The Battle of Hastings had begun. The opening moves were made by the Norman archers, who rained arrows down on the English with bows and crossbows, but repeated volleys failed to dislodge them from the hill. He then brought the body of his army to bear on the English, charging his infantry and knights up the hill towards the shield wall. The Normans suffered heavy losses in this first assault, however, as a sturdy defensive formation coupled with the height advantage stacked the odds generously in favor of the Saxons. Accounts don't agree on the specifics, but after fighting with the Saxons for some time, the Norman ranks broke and retreated down the hill, followed closely by the Saxons, who were breaking formation for the first time in the battle. This is where accounts disagree. The retreat was either a deliberate feint or a legitimate rout caused by a rumor that William was dead. In the feint description, the Normans wheeled around and charged into the exposed Saxons who were now at the bottom of the hill. Yet the English still managed to retain their edge in the fighting, and the Norman army then routed at the rumor of William's death. He rode towards them with his helmet off, rallying them by shouting something to the effect of, "I am alive, and by God's grace will still be victorious." The resurgent Norman army then crashed into the English again and inflicted heavy casualties. The other version is effectively the same, but condensed into a single rout and rally, including the same account of Duke William's heroics. The critical point is that the English had lost a good number of their men, leaving the shield wall thinner and weaker. The Normans pressed this new advantage, and it was likely around this stage that King Harold was killed, traditionally by an arrow in the eye, but the only contemporary account that mentions his death attributes it to Norman knights. By whatever method, as soon as Harold was killed, the English army began to collapse. Many soldiers fled, only to be cut down by the more mobile knights. The battle had lasted from early in the morning till late in the evening, which shows a little of how closely fought it was. With this one decisive battle, William secured the throne of England. The remaining English submitted to him in early December at Berkhamsted, and he was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. In the years that followed, the Normans drastically changed English society and Englishness itself.
What happens on the field at Hastings here in 1066 is Harold is killed, his brothers are killed, and a great many Englishmen are killed. And because William wins, in the generation that follows, the entirety, 9 out of 10 of the ruling elite in England are swept away, either killed or replaced in that 20-year period. And the Normans have very different ideas in their heads about the way that society should be regulated. So in England, in William the Conqueror's reign, you get massive change. You get the introduction of castles, which you haven't had before. You get the rebuilding of every major church, every cathedral, almost every abbey is ripped down and replaced. You get the abolition of slavery. This is something that's very rarely talked about even today. The fact that 20% of the English population was slaves, and within 2 generations of the Norman conquest, that's no longer the case. You know, the free become worse off. The free are forced to do more work for increased rents. You know, so their liberty is curtailed. Yeah. But a different kind of society emerges, a feudal society, for want of a better word. And they introduce chivalry, which is a different attitude with regard to political killing. So, in terms of architecture, art, warfare, including castles there, attitudes to human life. Language, the language we're speaking now is a hybrid of English and Norman French. On almost every measurable level, the conquest ushers in greater change than at any other point in English history.